The rain begins just after midnight. It falls in sheets across the empty hillside, drumming against cracked windows and pooling in the overgrown courtyards of Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. Each drop echoes through abandoned corridors where no one has worked for over 2 decades. The sound is strangely pure here, untainted by traffic or voices, just water meeting concrete and glass, in an endless rhythm that millions of people around the world have come to know intimately. They listen to it every night as they fall asleep, streaming these particular rain sounds through headphones and speakers, letting the steady patter lull them into unconsciousness. But they don't know where they're really listening to. They don't know what building shelters these sounds. The hospital sits in Gwangju, Gyeonggi Province, roughly an hour south of Seoul. During the day, it's merely derelict, just another example of urban decay slowly being reclaimed by vegetation and weather. But at night, when the rain comes, something shifts. The building takes on a different character entirely. Shadows pool in doorways that should be empty. The rain sounds somehow wrong, as if the building itself is breathing, as if the water falling on its roof is being pulled into something vast and hollow beneath. In 2012, CNN Travel named Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital one of the 7 freakiest places on the entire planet. It joined a list that included the catacombs beneath Paris and the Okigahara Forest in Japan, places with body counts measured in thousands. For a relatively small mental institution that operated for barely 2 decades, this recognition raised an obvious question. What happened here? What earned this hospital such a distinguished place among the world's most terrifying locations? The official story is frustratingly simple. Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital opened in 1979 and closed abruptly in 1996. The reasons given were vague. Financial difficulties, some reports claim. Structural concerns, said others. The owner simply disappeared one day, according to local officials, abandoning the facility and its patients without warning or explanation. But in South Korea, where mental health has historically been shrouded in stigma and silence, official stories often hide deeper truths. And the unofficial stories about Gonjiam are far more disturbing. Locals claim that patients died there under mysterious circumstances. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. They speak of experimental treatments that went catastrophically wrong, of restraints that left permanent scars, of screams that echoed through the valley long after the hospital claimed to have closed its doors. Some say the owner fled to avoid prosecution. Others insist he went mad himself, driven to psychosis by whatever he had created within those walls. There are whispers of a mass suicide among patients just before the closure, bodies discovered in rooms that had been locked from the outside. None of this has been definitively proven. Records from the hospital have vanished or were never properly maintained. The South Korean government has remained largely silent on the specifics. But the building itself seems to testify to something wrong, something that ordinary abandonment cannot explain. Visitors who venture inside describe an atmosphere of lingering anguish, as if trauma has soaked into the walls and ceiling tiles, becoming part of the structure's fundamental nature. And then there are the sounds. Urban explorers who break into Gonjiam at night report hearing things that shouldn't exist in an empty building. Footsteps on the floor above when they're certain they're alone. Doors closing softly in distant wings. Whispers that seem to come from the ventilation system, too low to understand, but clearly resembling human voices. Most disturbing are the sounds from the basement, from the area locals call Room 402, where patients were allegedly taken for treatments they never fully recovered from. From down there, explorers say they hear tapping, rhythmic and persistent, like fingernails on metal, like someone keeping time to music only they can hear. But it's the rain sounds that have made Gonjiam truly infamous, that have spread its influence far beyond urban exploration circles. Someone, at some point, recorded the rain falling on this hospital. They captured the specific acoustic signature of water hitting these particular surfaces, echoing through these particular spaces, and they uploaded it to the internet as ambient sound for relaxation and sleep. The recording went viral. Millions of downloads, countless streams. People in Tokyo and London and New York and Sydney began falling asleep to the sound of rain on Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital, never knowing what building provided their nightly comfort. The irony is almost unbearable. Korea's most haunted location, a place where unspeakable things allegedly occurred, has become a source of peace and rest for people who would never willingly spend a moment within its walls. This paradox raises the central question that haunts everyone who learns the truth. Why does the rain at Gonjiam sound so perfect for sleep? What is it about this specific location that produces such deeply comforting acoustics? Is it simply the architecture, the way the building's design happens to filter and amplify the rainfall? Or is something else at work, something that doesn't fit easily into rational explanation? Some believe the answer lies in the building's original purpose. Psychiatric hospitals were designed to be quiet, to isolate patients from external stimulation. The walls are thick, the windows small, the corridors arranged to minimize sound transmission. Perhaps these features, meant to contain human suffering, now create the perfect acoustic environment for rain, stripping away harsh frequencies and leaving only the purest, most soothing tones. But others propose darker theories. They suggest that the comfort people feel when listening to Gonjiam's rain is not despite the hospital's history, but because of it. That suffering on a massive scale leaves an imprint, a kind of psychic residue that paradoxically draws the living toward it. We are attracted to places of great emotion, even when that emotion is agony. The rain sounds don't just relax listeners. They connect them, however unknowingly, to something vast and terrible that once happened in that place, to pain that demands to be witnessed, even if it can never be fully understood. Tonight, the rain continues to fall. It will fall tomorrow night, and the night after that. And somewhere, right now, someone is listening to it, letting those sounds guide them towards sleep, completely unaware that they're being lulled into unconsciousness by the acoustic signature of one of the most disturbing places on Earth. They don't know about room 402. They don't know about the patients who vanished from records. They don't know what CNN discovered when they investigated this location. But soon you will, because this is where the story truly begins. The wind cuts differently across the hills of Gyeonggi Province in autumn. In 1963, when construction workers first broke ground on what would become Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital, they likely paid little attention to the isolation of the location. The facility rose from the earth during a time when South Korea was rebuilding itself, transforming from the ashes of war into something modern, something hopeful. Mental health treatment was still shrouded in misunderstanding and shame, and the government saw institutions like this as necessary steps toward progress. The hospital opened its doors in 1965, a sprawling complex of white buildings tucked into the mountainside, far enough from Seoul to ensure privacy, close enough to suggest legitimacy. In those early years, according to municipal records that still exist in the Gwangju City archives, Gonjiam functioned as intended. Doctors treated patients suffering from what the medical establishment of the time called nervous disorders, melancholia, and various states of mental distress. Families brought their relatives here, seeking help that traditional medicine could not provide. The hospital employed a staff of 23, including 4 licensed psychiatrists, a dozen nurses, and various support personnel. Photographs from 1967 show clean hallways, patients sitting in common areas, staff members posing proudly in their white coats. Everything appears normal, even mundane. But institutions have a way of changing, especially when they exist beyond the constant scrutiny of public eyes. By the early 1970s, former employees would later claim that the hospital's character began to shift. The first director, a man named Dr. Kim, whose full identity remains disputed in available records, left under circumstances that were never fully explained. His replacement, the figure who would become central to the hospital's dark mythology, arrived in 1972. This second director's name appears in some documents as Dr. Yang, though local accounts use different names, suggesting either confusion, deliberate obfuscation, or the blending of multiple people into one legendary figure. What we know from employment records is that staff turnover increased dramatically during the mid-1970s. A nurse who worked there from 1974 to 1976 gave an interview to a local newspaper in 2008, speaking on condition of anonymity. She described a gradual deterioration in patient care standards, budget cuts that reduced staff, and a growing atmosphere of secrecy around certain wings of the hospital. She mentioned, specifically, that the 4th floor became restricted access, requiring special permission even for regular nursing staff to enter. Room 402 sits at the end of the 4th floor corridor. In the hospital's original blueprints, preserved in provincial construction archives. This room is designated as a standard patient ward, no different from dozens of others throughout the building. But according to testimony from multiple sources collected over the decades, Room 402 was converted sometime in the mid-1970s into what the director called a special treatment facility. The windows were covered with material that blocked outside observation. Additional locks were installed. Medical equipment not listed in any official inventory began appearing in the room, carried in during night shifts when fewer witnesses were present. The nature of what happened in Room 402 exists in that shadowy space between documented fact and persistent legend. No official records describe experiments. No medical journals published by the hospital staff mention unorthodox procedures. Yet the stories remain remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had no apparent contact with each other. They speak of patients being taken to the room for treatments that lasted hours, emerging in states of severe distress or profound sedation. Some witnesses claim to have heard sounds from the room, mechanical noises mixed with human voices, though the thickness of the walls and the room's isolated position make such accounts difficult to verify. A maintenance worker who repaired plumbing in the hospital during 1978 told his family years later that he once glimpsed the interior of Room 402 while the door stood briefly open. He described restraining equipment far more extensive than what would be used for standard psychiatric care, and tables fitted with straps that showed signs of repeated forceful use. His daughter shared this account with paranormal researchers in 2012, long after her father had passed away, making independent verification impossible. The deaths began appearing in hospital records around 1979. Patient mortality rates, which had remained relatively stable through the hospital's first decade, started climbing. The official causes listed in available documents range from heart failure to complications from existing conditions, all medically plausible explanations. But the frequency raised questions that apparently went unanswered. Between 1979 and 1983, according to fragmentary records, at least 37 patients died at Gonjiam. For a facility that typically housed between 70 and 90 patients at any given time, this represented a disturbing percentage. Former patients who were released during this period, or their family members, occasionally shared troubling accounts. One woman, whose brother spent 6 months at Gonjiam in 1981, described visiting him and finding him terrified of the 4th floor, refusing to explain why beyond saying that people went up there and came back different, if they came back at all. Another family reported that their relative, admitted for depression, developed intense phobias that had not existed before hospitalization, including an irrational fear of the color white and an inability to tolerate the sound of machinery. The hospital continued operating through the 1980s, though its reputation in the local community had begun to sour. Families grew reluctant to commit relatives there. Rumors circulated about the director's methods, about patients disappearing from their beds, about screams that echoed through the ventilation system late at night. Yet the facility remained licensed, inspections apparently finding nothing actionable, or perhaps finding nothing at all. The machinery of bureaucracy moved slowly, and mental institutions existed in a gray area where oversight was minimal and public interest was low. The timeline accelerates as it approaches the hospital's final year. In 1995, something shifted. Multiple sources from the local area remember this period, though their accounts vary in specific details. Some speak of ambulances arriving with unusual frequency. Others mention seeing smoke from the hospital grounds, though no fire was ever officially reported. A shopkeeper in the nearby town recalled that staff members who usually purchased supplies stopped coming, and when she asked about it, was told the hospital was restricting outside contact. The event that would seal Gonjiam's fate allegedly occurred in October of 1996, though the exact date remains disputed. According to the most widely circulated version of the story, patients in the hospital's East Wing engaged in a coordinated mass suicide. The number of dead varies depending on the source, from as few as 13 to as many as 42. The methods described are equally varied and increasingly gruesome in their retelling. What makes this particular legend difficult to assess is the absence of any police report, news coverage, or official documentation confirming such an event occurred. Researchers attempting to verify the mass suicide have found only fragments and contradictions. No death certificates matching such an incident exist in provincial records. Newspaper archives from October 1996 contain no stories about Gonjiam. Yet the belief in this event remains powerful in local memory, repeated so often and with such conviction that it has taken on the weight of fact in popular understanding. What we can confirm is that Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital ceased operations suddenly in late 1996. The business license was not renewed. Staff were apparently dismissed or departed on their own. Patients were transferred to other facilities, though records of these transfers are incomplete or missing entirely. The director, the figure at the center of so much speculation, vanished from public record. No death certificate exists under the names most commonly associated with him. No forwarding address appears in any documentation. He simply disappeared, adding one final mystery to the hospital's dark legacy. The building itself stood empty after 1996, slowly deteriorating as weather and time worked their inevitable destruction. The provincial government took ownership of the property when unpaid taxes accumulated. Various plans for the site were proposed over the years, but never implemented. The facility gained a reputation as a place to avoid, somewhere that drew the curious and the reckless, especially after dark. What remains most unsettling about Gonjiam's history is not any single dramatic event, but rather the accumulation of questions that have no satisfying answers. Why did staff turnover increase so dramatically? What happened in room 402? How did 37 people die in 4 years without triggering serious investigation? Why does no official record exist of the hospital's final days? And where did the director go? Perhaps we are drawn to these mysteries because they represent a failure of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Mental hospitals occupy a unique space in our collective anxiety, places where society sent those it could not understand or help, often forgetting them behind locked doors. The idea that such a place could transform from legitimate medical facility into something monstrous speaks to our deepest fears about institutional power and human cruelty. The line between documented history and folklore has blurred at Gonjiam until the two become almost indistinguishable. What we are left with is a ruined building on a hillside and a collection of stories that refuse to die, passed from person to person, each retelling adding new details while the original truth, whatever it was, recedes further into shadow. The abandoned Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital sat in darkness for 3 years before the first explorers arrived. By the spring of 2004, the main gate had rusted open just wide enough for a determined person to slip through. The Korean urban exploration community was still in its infancy then, mostly composed of university students with digital cameras and an appetite for places the rest of society had forgotten. They shared coordinates on primitive internet forums, typing out directions that read more like treasure maps than proper addresses. Among these early adventurers, Gonjiam held a particular mystique. It was close enough to Seoul to reach by train and taxi, yet isolated enough to feel genuinely dangerous. Kim Jae-hyun was among the first documented visitors. A 23-year-old architecture student from Hanyang University, he ventured to Gonjiam on a humid Saturday in June of 2004 with 2 classmates. In posts he later made on the Dom Cafe forum Urban Exploration Korea, he described their initial impression of the hospital as surprisingly mundane. The exterior looked like any other abandoned building in the Korean countryside. Vines crawled up the southern wall. Windows on the upper floors were broken, their glass teeth catching the afternoon sun. The 3 students entered through a side entrance on the ground floor, the door already hanging from a single hinge. Kim wrote that the first oddity occurred approximately 20 minutes into their exploration. They were walking down the second-floor corridor, their footsteps echoing on the tile floor, when they heard a door slam somewhere ahead of them. The sound was unmistakable, Kim insisted, the heavy bang of wood against a metal frame. All 3 students stopped moving. The air in the corridor was completely still. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have moved a door with such force. Kim's friend, whose name he never disclosed in the posts, suggested they leave immediately. But Kim wanted to investigate. They continued forward slowly, checking each room as they passed. According to Kim's account, they discovered that all the doors in that section of the corridor were either missing entirely or wedged open by debris. There was no door that could have made the sound they heard. This detail bothered Kim more than anything supernatural might have. He was a rational person, he emphasized repeatedly in his forum posts, someone who believed in physics and material explanations. But there was no material explanation for that sound. They pressed deeper into the hospital anyway, documenting rooms with their cameras, taking notes on the building's construction and deterioration. It was in the basement where Kim claims his skepticism began to fracture completely. The three students found the stairwell leading down and debated whether to explore the lower level. The light from their flashlight seemed weaker down there, Kim wrote, as if the darkness itself was thicker. They descended anyway. The basement corridor was lined with small rooms, likely storage areas or utility spaces. About halfway down this corridor, they discovered a wheelchair. It was positioned in the exact center of the hallway, facing them. Kim distinctly remembered thinking how strange it was that the wheelchair sat so perfectly centered, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. They photographed the wheelchair and continued exploring. 10 minutes later, when they returned through the same corridor to head back upstairs, the wheelchair had moved. It now faced the opposite direction and sat at least 3 meters further down the hallway. All three students saw it. All three knew with certainty that no one had touched it. They were the only people in the building. They had been together the entire time. Kim described a feeling of profound wrongness settling over the group, a primitive fear that made his hands shake as he took photographs of the wheelchair's new position. This was when his friend began to panic. The same friend who had wanted to leave after the door slammed. He started breathing rapidly, saying he felt like something was watching them from the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Kim admitted in his posts that he felt it too, a presence that seemed to move with them through the basement. They decided to leave, but as they turned toward the stairs, they heard it. The sound of screaming. Human voices screaming in agony and terror, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, from a section they had not yet explored. The screams were layered, multiple voices overlapping, some high-pitched and some low, some near and some far. Kim wrote that the sounds reminded him of old recordings he had heard from the Korean War, the cries of wounded soldiers. The three students ran. They did not stop running until they were outside the building, across the overgrown courtyard, and through the rusted gate. Only when they reached the main road did they stop to catch their breath. None of them could explain what they had heard. They tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there were other explorers in the basement. Perhaps there were animals trapped somewhere, making sounds that resembled human screaming. But Kim wrote that these explanations felt hollow even as they spoke them aloud. They all knew what they had heard. Those were human screams, desperate and filled with pain, coming from a building that had been empty for 3 years. Kim uploaded his photographs to the forum a week later. Most showed exactly what you would expect from an abandoned hospital. Peeling paint, broken furniture, medical equipment left to rust. But 3 photographs showed something else. In an image of the second-floor corridor, a faint figure appeared to stand in a doorway at the far end of the hall. Kim swore the hallway had been empty when he took the shot. The figure was translucent, barely visible, but unmistakably human in shape. In another photograph, taken in what appeared to be a patient room, a shadow fell across the floor in a pattern that suggested a person standing beside the window, despite the room being empty. The third photograph was the most disturbing. It showed the wheelchair in the basement, and seated in the wheelchair was a dark mass that vaguely resembled a hunched human figure. The mass had no clear features, no face or limbs, just a suggestion of presence. The responses to Kim's posts were explosive. Within days, hundreds of forum members were discussing Gonjiam. Some called the photographs fake. Others demanded the exact location. A few claimed to have had similar experiences at other abandoned sites. But Kim's account struck a nerve in the Korean urban exploration community because of how measured and detailed it was. He did not claim to have seen ghosts. He simply described what happened and admitted he could not explain it. This honesty made his story more credible than the wild tales that usually circulated on such forums. Then, 2 weeks after posting his initial account, Kim added a final update. He wrote that he had developed all the photographs from the Gonjiam exploration, including shots he had not initially uploaded. In several additional images, he claimed to have discovered more figures. They appeared in backgrounds, in doorways, in mirrors. He counted 9 distinct figures across all his photographs. But what disturbed him most, he wrote, was that when he examined the photographs closely, he realized that some of the figures appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Directly at him. He described feeling watched ever since returning from Gonjiam. He had trouble sleeping. He kept seeing movement in his peripheral vision. The final line of his final post read simply, "I am not going back. I am not discussing this anymore. Please do not contact me about Gonjiam." Kim Jae-hyun never posted on the forum again. Multiple members tried to reach him through private messages and email. All attempts went unanswered. His classmates, the two who had accompanied him to Gonjiam, also refused to discuss the experience publicly. One reportedly transferred to a university in Busan. The other deleted all his online accounts. This silence only amplified the legend. Here were three rational people, students of architecture and design, who had entered Gonjiam as skeptics and emerged so shaken, they refused to speak about what they witnessed. Their retreat from the conversation gave weight to the experience in a way that continued claims could never have achieved. Park Min-seo was another early explorer whose account spread widely through Korean internet forums. She was a 27-year-old office worker from Seoul who visited Gonjiam in October of 2005 with a group of 5 friends. Park's testimony, posted on the Naver Cafe Paranormal Korea, focused on the 4th floor of the hospital. Her group had climbed the main stairwell, passing through the lower floors without incident. But the 4th floor felt different, Park wrote. The temperature dropped noticeably. Their breath misted in the air despite it being a mild autumn evening. The corridor on the 4th floor was longer than those on the floors below, stretching into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. Park's group explored several patient rooms on the 4th floor. In one room, they found restraints still attached to a bed frame. In another, medical charts lay scattered across the floor, the pages yellowed and water-damaged, but still partially legible. Park photographed these charts, later translating sections of them in her forum posts. The charts documented patients with diagnoses like severe depression, schizophrenia, and violent psychosis. Reading the clinical descriptions of these patients' suffering disturbed Park more than any supernatural occurrence might have. These were real people who had experienced genuine torment in these rooms. Then, as Park's group prepared to leave the 4th floor, all the doors in the corridor began slamming simultaneously. One after another, in rapid succession, every door that was still attached to its frame swung shut with tremendous force. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Park described it as being inside a drum during a performance. The slamming continued for what she estimated was 15 to 20 seconds, though she admitted time felt distorted in that moment. When the slamming finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. No one in the group spoke. No one moved. They stood frozen in the corridor, trying to process what had just happened. Park wrote that they checked the corridor carefully before leaving. There were no other people in the building. They had been systematic in clearing each floor as they climbed. There was no wind. The windows on the 4th floor were intact, no breaches that could create a draft strong enough to move doors. Yet the doors had slammed. All of them. At once. Park's conclusion in her forum post was cautious, but clear. She wrote that she could not explain what happened through natural means, and that the experience had changed her understanding of what was possible. By 2006, Gonjiam had transformed from an obscure abandoned building into a pilgrimage site for Korean thrill seekers. Internet forums dedicated to urban exploration and paranormal investigation buzzed constantly with new accounts from the hospital. Not everyone who visited reported strange experiences. Some explorers spent hours in the building and encountered nothing unusual. But enough people reported phenomena like doors slamming, objects moving, disembodied voices, and unexplained figures in photographs that a pattern emerged. The most commonly reported experiences occurred in the basement, on the 2nd floor, and on the 4th floor. Specific rooms seemed to generate more reports than others. Room 402 was mentioned repeatedly. The basement corridor with the wheelchair became notorious. The photographic evidence accumulated slowly but steadily. Dozens of explorers captured anomalies in their images. Orbs of light, shadow figures, mists that appeared in empty hallways. Skeptics argued these were simply artifacts of digital photography, dust particles, lens flares, or motion blur. And certainly, many of the photographs could be explained through such mundane causes. But some images resisted easy explanation. A photograph taken by user Saul Ghost Hunter in 2007 showed a clear handprint on a dusty window from the inside of a locked room. Another user, Daegu Nightwalker, captured what appeared to be a face reflected in a broken mirror in the basement, despite being alone when the photograph was taken. The cultural impact of these early accounts cannot be overstated. Gonjiam became embedded in Korean internet folklore, a rite of passage for young people testing their courage. Television programs began featuring the hospital in segments about haunted locations. Amateur documentary makers attempted to spend nights in the building, filming their experiences. The local police eventually began regular patrols to discourage trespassers, but this only added to the location's forbidden allure. The harder it became to access Gonjiam, the more prestigious a successful exploration became within the community. What makes these early testimonies particularly compelling is their consistency despite coming from independent sources. The same phenomena were reported by people who had never communicated with each other, who visited the hospital months or years apart. Doors slamming in windless corridors, wheelchairs moving independently, screaming from empty rooms, figures appearing in photographs. This pattern suggests either a shared psychological response to the environment, a form of collective suggestion amplified by internet discussions, or the possibility that something genuinely anomalous was occurring in that building. The truth, as with most paranormal claims, likely exists somewhere in the uncertain space between rational explanation and inexplicable phenomenon. What remains undeniable is that Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital captured the imagination of a generation of Korean explorers, transforming from a forgotten building into a legend that continues to disturb and fascinate. The studio lights were unbearable that night, turning the broadcast booth into a pressure cooker of anticipation. October 13th, 2012. Channel 7 News had promised its viewers something unprecedented, something that would blur the boundaries between investigative journalism and supernatural entertainment. The Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital, abandoned for decades, would finally reveal its secrets during a live, uninterrupted broadcast. Or so they thought. Producer Kim Sang-woo had been planning the special for 8 months. His vision was simple yet ambitious. Assemble a team of seasoned journalists, pair them with professional paranormal investigators, and document whatever remained inside those crumbling walls. The program was scheduled to run for 3 hours during prime time, from 9 in the evening until midnight. They had promoted it relentlessly, plastering advertisements across every media platform the network owned. The tagline promised viewers a journey into darkness they would never forget. That promise, at least, turned out to be prophetic. The team assembled at the hospital gates just before dusk. Lead investigator Park Ji-hoon had investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations throughout South Korea, always finding rational explanations for the phenomena people reported. He carried himself with the confidence of a skeptic, someone who believed that science and logic could demystify any ghost story. Beside him stood reporter Choi Min-young, a rising star known for her unflinching approach to difficult subjects. She had covered war zones and natural disasters without flinching. A derelict mental hospital, she told colleagues, would be a walk in the park. The camera crew consisted of 3 professionals. Head cameraman Lee Dong-hyun had 20 years of experience filming everything from presidential addresses to crime scenes. His assistant, a younger man named Young Tae-kyung, operated the secondary camera that would capture different angles. Audio technician Han Seo-yoon managed the sound equipment, a complex array of microphones and recording devices designed to capture every whisper, every creak, every ambient noise the building might produce. They also brought equipment operator Kwon Young-min, who handled the specialized night vision cameras and thermal imaging devices that would allow them to see in complete darkness. The broadcast began with textbook precision. Choi Min-young stood before the hospital's main entrance, delivering her opening monologue with practiced ease. She outlined the hospital's history, constructed in 1979, operational for just over a decade before financial troubles and disturbing rumors forced its closure in 1996. The building had been designed to house 300 patients, but according to records, occupancy during its final years had dropped to barely 70 individuals. Those who remained, witnesses claimed, were the most severe cases, patients whose families had abandoned them or who had nowhere else to go. The first 30 minutes unfolded exactly as planned. The team moved through the main lobby, their footsteps echoing off walls covered in peeling paint and mold. Park Ji-hoon narrated their progress, explaining the difference between actual paranormal phenomena and the psychological tricks our minds play in frightening environments. He demonstrated how shadows could create the illusion of movement, how old buildings settle and groan in ways that mimic human sound. The broadcast was educational, slightly eerie, but ultimately controlled. Viewers at home numbered in the millions, according to real-time ratings, data streaming into the network control room. People gathered around televisions in their living rooms, in restaurants, in dormitories. Social media platforms exploded with commentary. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when the investigation team would encounter something they could not explain. Most expected nothing would happen, that the whole broadcast would amount to an elaborate anticlimax. They were checking their phones, half watching, treating it as background entertainment, while they went about their evening routines. Then, at approximately 9:47 in the evening, exactly 47 minutes into the broadcast, everything changed. The team had reached the third floor, moving down a corridor that once housed the most severely disturbed patients. Han Seo-yoon, the audio technician, suddenly stopped walking. Through her headphones, she later testified, she heard voices. Not the ambient noise of the building, not interference from their equipment. Voices, speaking in clear, measured tones. She signaled for silence, and the entire team froze. The cameras continued rolling, capturing her expression shifting from professional concentration to genuine confusion. She played back the recording for the team, holding the headphones so the microphone could pick up what she had captured. Even through the television speakers, viewers at home could hear it. A voice, distinctly feminine, reciting what sounded like numbers. 73, 89, 142. Another voice, deeper and masculine, responded with what seemed to be names. Kim.O. Park.O. Lee.Dat. The pattern continued for perhaps 20 seconds before dissolving into static. Park Ji-hoon, still maintaining his skeptical composure, suggested they were picking up radio interference, perhaps from a nearby emergency services frequency. But Han Seo-yoon shook her head. She had been filtering out those frequencies all night. These voices were coming from inside the building. More disturbing, when researchers later cross-referenced the numbers and names with archival patient records from Gonjiam, they matched. Room numbers and patient surnames, recorded in the precise order they appeared in the hospital's admission logs from 1994. The team pressed forward, though tension now permeated every frame. Viewers noticed subtle changes in body language. Young Tak-kyung kept his camera moving erratically, as if he could not quite decide where to point it. Choi Min-young's narration became more hesitant, her questions to Park Ji-hoon more pointed. "What if this is real?" she asked. "What if there is something here that cannot be explained?" They reached the end of the corridor, where a stairwell descended into darkness. The fourth floor above them had partially collapsed years earlier, making it inaccessible. The stairs leading down, however, appeared structurally sound. Park Ji-hoon decided they should explore the lower levels, particularly the basement where treatment rooms and administrative offices had been located. Lee Dong-hyun, the head cameraman, volunteered to lead the way down the stair. His camera's light cut through the blackness, revealing concrete steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. What happened next occurred too quickly for anyone to fully process in the moment. Lee Dong-hyun descended perhaps 5 or 6 steps, when, according to every witness present, he suddenly lurched forward as if shoved violently from behind. His camera tumbled from his hands, the image spinning wildly as it bounced down the stairwell. The audio captured his scream, a sound of pure shock and pain, followed by the sickening thuds of a body striking concrete. The secondary camera, still in Young Tak-kyung's hands, shook violently as everyone rushed forward. Viewers at home watched chaos unfold in real time, the image fragmenting into motion blur and confused shouts. But here was the detail that would haunt everyone who watched. In the 3 seconds before Lee Dong-hyun fell, Young Tak-kyung's camera had been pointed directly at him. The footage showed, unmistakably, that no one was behind the cameraman. The corridor was empty. Yet Lee Dong-hyun moved forward as if struck by considerable force, his body arching in a way that suggested impact between his shoulder blades. Medical professionals, who later analyzed the footage, confirmed that his motion was inconsistent with tripping or losing balance. Something had made contact with him. Something with mass and intention. The broadcast did not cut immediately. For perhaps 90 seconds, viewers watched as the team scrambled down the stairs to reach their injured colleague. Lee Dong-hyun lay at the bottom landing, conscious but clearly in severe pain. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, later diagnosed as a compound fracture. But it was his face that disturbed people most. Pure terror, eyes wide and unfocused, lips moving in what appeared to be frantic prayer or pleading. He kept repeating this same phrase over and over. "She pushed me. She pushed me. The woman pushed me." The team attempted to maintain composure, to continue the broadcast while calling for emergency services. Park Ji-hoon knelt beside Lee Dong-hyun, trying to calm him, while Choi Min-young spoke into the camera about getting medical help. But the equipment had begun malfunctioning in ways that defied technical explanation. The lights flickered and died, plunging sections of the stairwell into absolute darkness. The cameras developed severe interference, their images dissolving into horizontal lines and color distortion. Han Seo-yoon's audio equipment emitted a high-pitched shriek that forced her to rip the headphones from her ears. Later examination would show that multiple electronic components had burned out simultaneously, despite being powered by separate battery sources. Then came the voice. Every piece of recording equipment still functioning captured it. A woman's voice, speaking in Korean, with an accent that linguists would later identify as characteristic of the Gyeonggi dialect from several decades earlier. The words were clear, emotionless, chilling in their directness. "You should not be here. This place remembers. We all remember." That was when the network made the decision to cut the live feed. At 9:53 in the evening, 6 minutes after Lee Dong-hyun's fall, the screen went black for viewers across the country. A message appeared, apologizing for technical difficulties. The broadcast never resumed. Instead, the network aired a brief statement shortly before midnight, confirming that crew members had been injured and that the investigation had been terminated for safety reasons. They promised a full explanation would be provided after they had reviewed all footage and interviewed the team members. Emergency medical services arrived at Gonjiam, approximately 40 minutes after the 911 call. They found the team huddled in the main lobby, having evacuated the building as quickly as Lee Dong-hyun's injuries would permit. 2 ambulances transported people to Seoul National University Hospital. Lee Dong-hyun went immediately into surgery for his fractured arm and several broken ribs. But the more serious cases were Young Tae-kyung and Han Seo-yoon. The assistant cameraman had become non-responsive during the evacuation, staring straight ahead without acknowledging questions or commands. Medical staff initially suspected shock from witnessing his colleague's fall. But his condition worsened over the following hours. He developed what psychiatrists classified as acute dissociative disorder, becoming unable or unwilling to speak about anything he had experienced. He would spend 3 weeks under psychiatric care, undergoing intensive therapy. Even months later, Young Tae-kyung could not discuss the broadcast without experiencing severe anxiety attacks. Han Seo-yoon's case proved even more disturbing. She claimed she could still hear the voices, even miles away from Gonjiam, even after all her equipment had been turned off and removed. The recordings played in her head continuously, she told doctors. Numbers and names, over and over, an endless loop of patient data being recited by the dead. She required sedation and was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, though her therapists privately admitted her symptoms defied conventional understanding. The voices, she maintained, were not hallucinations. They were memories, imprinted somehow into her consciousness during those few minutes on the 3rd floor. Channel 7 News faced immediate and intense scrutiny. Critics accused the network of staging an elaborate hoax to boost ratings. Surely, they argued, the entire broadcast had been scripted, the falls and equipment failures carefully choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. The network vehemently denied these allegations, offering to submit all raw footage for independent analysis. But here they encountered a problem. Significant portions of the recording were corrupted beyond recovery. The digital files contained sections that would not play, displaying only error messages. When technical experts examined the source files, they found anomalies in the data structure itself, patterns that should not exist in properly recorded video. The network eventually aired a heavily edited, 40-minute special about the incident, but it raised more questions than it answered. They showed selected clips, the team entering the building, Han Seo-yoon's discovery of the voices, portions of the chaotic aftermath. But the actual moment of Lee Dong-hyun's fall was conspicuously absent. Network executives claimed that footage was among the corrupted sections, irrecoverable despite their best efforts. Skeptics saw this as convenient proof that nothing supernatural had actually occurred. Believers saw it as evidence of something so disturbing that it could not be shown to the public. In the months following the broadcast, Gonjiam transformed from a local curiosity into a national obsession. The hospital became South Korea's most famous haunted location, referenced constantly in popular culture. Horror films incorporated elements of the story. YouTube channels dedicated to paranormal investigation made pilgrimages to the site, though most were turned away by authorities who had reinforced security measures. The building became a magnet for curiosity seekers and ghost hunters, people desperate to experience what the Channel 7 team had encountered. The crew members themselves largely refused further interviews. Park Ji-hoon, the lead investigator who had begun the night as a proud skeptic, quietly retired from paranormal investigation. He gave one brief statement to a magazine 6 months later, saying simply that some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left unopened. Choi Min-young continued her journalism career but never again covered supernatural subjects. When asked about that night, she would only say that she had learned the difference between reporting on fear and experiencing it firsthand. Lee Dong-hyun, the cameraman who fell down the stairs, recovered physically but bore psychological scars. He continued working in television production, but refused assignments involving anything remotely connected to supernatural or paranormal subjects. In a rare candid moment during a private conversation that was later leaked, he told a colleague that he knew what had pushed him. He had felt hands, cold and impossibly strong, pressing against his back. He had smelled something in that moment, antiseptic and decay mixed together. And he had heard breathing, right behind his ear, belonging to someone who should not have been there. The incident achieved what decades of local rumors could not. It provided documentation, however imperfect, of phenomena that resisted rational explanation. The voices matching patient records, the synchronized equipment failures, the injuries sustained by crew members, all of it created a narrative that could not be easily dismissed. Even those who believed in logical explanations struggled to account for every detail. The broadcast had been seen by millions, creating countless witnesses to at least the televised portion of events. Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital stands today as it stood then, slowly crumbling into ruin. But it is no longer just a building. It has become a symbol, a focal point for questions about what remains after death, about whether places can retain memories of suffering, about the boundaries between the natural and supernatural world. The 47-minute broadcast that was meant to demystify fear instead amplified it, transforming skepticism into uncertainty and uncertainty into dread. What the cameras captured that night continues to haunt everyone who saw it, a reminder that some mysteries only deepen when we shine light upon them. In the autumn of 2017, a peculiar audio file began circulating through the obscure corners of YouTube and wellness app forums. It was labeled simply as Gonjiam Rain, a 45-minute recording that purported to capture nothing more than rainfall against the abandoned Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital in South Korea. Within months, it had accumulated millions of plays. Within a year, it spawned dozens of imitators, sleep app integrations, and a devoted following of insomniacs who swore they could not rest without it. What made this unremarkable, it seemed, was that the recording was anything but ordinary. The original uploader, a Korean sound designer who went by the username Silent Watcher, claimed to have placed professional-grade recording equipment in the ruins of Gonjiam Hospital during a thunderstorm in August of 2017. The hospital, which had been shuttered since 1996 amid allegations of patient abuse and mysterious deaths, had long been considered one of the most haunted locations in Asia. Silent Watcher insisted the recording was unedited, captured in a single take over the course of one rainy evening. He uploaded it to YouTube with minimal description and no particular fanfare. Then, something strange happened. People could not stop listening to it. By early 2018, the Gonjiam Rain recording had been downloaded over 3 million times. Sleep apps like Calm and Headspace were flooded with requests to add it to their libraries. Wellness forums filled with testimonials from chronic insomniacs, who claimed the recording granted them their first full night's sleep in years. The comment sections beneath the various uploads became almost devotional in tone. Users described feeling an inexplicable sense of peace while listening, a gentle pulling sensation that drew them effortlessly into unconsciousness. Many reported vivid, but not unpleasant dreams. Some mentioned feeling as though they were not alone while listening, but in a comforting way, like a presence watching over them. It was this last detail that first caught the attention of Marcus Chen, a forensic audio analyst based in Los Angeles. Chen specialized in extracting and clarifying degraded audio for criminal investigations, using sophisticated software that could isolate frequencies imperceptible to the casual listener. In March of 2018, a friend sent him the Gonjiam Rain file as a curiosity, mentioning the strange hold it seemed to have on its audio. Chen loaded it into his professional audio workstation more out of idle interest than genuine investigation. What he discovered kept him awake for the next 72 hours. The surface level of the recording was exactly as advertised. Rain striking metal and concrete. Wind moving through broken windows. The occasional creak of settling infrastructure. But when Chen began isolating specific frequency ranges, patterns emerged that should not have been there. In the subsonic range below 20 Hz and largely inaudible to human ears without specialized equipment, he detected a rhythmic pulsing. The pattern repeated every 8.3 seconds with mechanical precision. It sounded, Chen later told interviewers, remarkably similar to the charging cycle of an electroconvulsive therapy machine, the kind that had been in widespread use in psychiatric institutions during the 1980s and 90s. Chen went deeper. Using spectral analysis, he examined the mid-range frequencies where human speech typically resides. Here, beneath the constant wash of rain, he found something that made his skin crawl. Whispers. Dozens of them, layered and overlapping, so faint that they existed just at the threshold of perception. Chen spent weeks isolating and amplifying these vocal elements. What emerged was a collection of phrases in Korean, many of them fragmentary and difficult to parse, but some disturbingly clear. Help us. Don't leave. It hurts. We're still here. Cold. Not even. So cold. The voices, Chen noted, sounded like they were coming from different distances, as though scattered throughout a large space. Some seemed close, almost intimate. Others echoed as if from far away, down long corridors or through walls. Chen published his findings on a professional audio engineering forum, complete with annotated spectrograms and isolated audio samples. The response was immediate and divided. Some engineers confirmed his findings, conducting their own analyses and discovering similar anomaly. Others insisted the patterns were artifacts of compression, coincidental noise that the human brain was interpreting as speech, a phenomenon known as audio pareidolia. The debate quickly spilled beyond professional circles and into the mainstream. News outlets picked up the story. YouTube channels dedicated to the paranormal dissected the recording frame by frame. The Gonjiam Rain file became the subject of intense scrutiny and wild speculation. Yet, even as the controversy grew, so did the recording's popularity. If anything, the revelations seemed to enhance its appeal. Downloads increased. More sleep apps added it to their catalogs. The comment sections filled with users who claimed they had always sensed something beneath the rain, some presence or intention that made the recording more than simple ambient noise. A user named Sleepless and Seal wrote that the voices felt like companions, like the hospital itself was singing them to sleep. Another, going by the handle Nighterers, described the recording as a lullaby from the other side, unsettling in concept, but profoundly comforting in practice. Dr. Sarah Venn, a psychoacoustic researcher at the University of Toronto, became fascinated by this paradox. Why would people actively seek out a recording laced with disturbing subliminal content as a sleep aid? In 2019, she conducted a study with 300 volunteers who regularly used the Gonjiam rain recording to fall asleep. Half were informed about the hidden audio elements, half were not. Both groups reported similar benefits: improved sleep onset, longer sleep duration, and a subjective sense of restfulness. However, when Ven's team analyzed the sleep architecture using polysomnography, they found something unusual. Listeners spent slightly more time in REM sleep and exhibited unusual patterns of brain activity during deep sleep stages, patterns that Ven described as resembling a meditative state. Ven proposed a controversial theory. She suggested that the subliminal elements, the rhythmic pulsing, the whispered voices, the distant sounds of distress, were creating a form of psychological white noise. Our brains, she argued, are constantly scanning for threats, especially in vulnerable states like sleep. The faint suggestions of human presence in the recording might be triggering a deep, primal response, the sense of being in a tribe, surrounded by others, even if those others are suffering. This communal aspect, even experienced at a subconscious level, could be providing a sense of safety that modern, isolated sleepers desperately crave. In essence, the trauma embedded in the recording was paradoxically creating comfort by simulating the presence of others. Not everyone accepted such rational explanations. Park Ji-yoon, a Korean parapsychologist and former psychiatric nurse, offered a different interpretation. Park had worked briefly at Gonjiam Hospital in the early 1990s, just years before its closure. She remembered the building as a place of profound suffering, where patients endured experimental treatments and were, according to persistent rumors, subjected to abuses that were never formally investigated. Park believed that extreme emotional events could leave what she called imprints on physical spaces, a kind of psychic residue that persisted long after the events themselves had ended. According to Park's theory, the Gonjiam rain recording had captured something genuine, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but the accumulated emotional energy of decades of pain, fear, and despair. This energy, she suggested, had literally soaked into the walls, the floors, the very air of the hospital. When Silent Watcher placed his recording equipment in that space, he captured not just ambient sound, but the echo of trauma itself. And that echo, Park argued, resonated with something deep in the human psyche. Perhaps we are drawn to it because on some level we recognize it, we understand suffering, and hearing it acknowledged, even subliminally, validates our own pain and struggle. The creator of the original recording, Silent Watcher, remained largely silent on these debates. In one of his rare public statements, posted to a Korean audio engineering forum in late 2018, he said only that he had recorded exactly what was there, nothing more, nothing less. He denied any manipulation or editing. He expressed surprise at the recording's popularity, but offered no explanation for it. Some researchers and enthusiasts have tried to contact him for further interviews, but he has not responded. His YouTube channel continued to host the original upload, accumulating views and comments, but he posted no new content and engaged with none of the controversy swirling around his work. In 2020, a team of audio researchers from Seoul National University attempted to replicate the Gonjiam rain recording. They brought similar equipment to the abandoned hospital during a rainstorm and recorded for several hours. Their recordings captured rain, wind, and structural sounds. But when analyzed, they contained none of the anomalies present in the original file. No subsonic pulses, no whispered voices, no patterns that could not be explained by normal environmental noise. This only deepened the mystery. Either Silent Watcher had been present during some unique confluence of conditions, or something about his specific recording session had captured phenomena that could not be easily reproduced. The phenomenon has spawned numerous theories, each attempting to bridge the gap between the measurable and the inexplicable. Some suggest that infrasound, the subsonic frequencies detected by Chen, can induce feelings of unease or presence, but also, paradoxically, relaxation when presented in certain patterns. Others point to the power of suggestion, arguing that once people believe a recording contains hidden elements, their brains will find them, whether they exist or not. Still others embrace fully paranormal explanations, insisting that the recording is genuinely haunted, a bottled ghost that reaches through speakers and headphones to touch the minds of millions. What remains undeniable is the recording's continuing influence. As of 2024, variations in copies of the Gonjiam Rain recording have been played billions of times across various platforms. It has inspired academic papers, podcast episodes, documentary segments, and countless late-night conversations about the nature of perception, trauma, and the spaces we leave behind. The abandoned hospital itself, already a destination for urban explorers and paranormal enthusiasts, has seen increased traffic, with many visitors attempting to experience firsthand the atmosphere that Silent Watcher supposedly captured. Whether the Gonjiam Rain recording represents a genuine paranormal phenomenon, an acoustic curiosity, or simply the power of collective belief remains an open question. What it undeniably demonstrates is the strange and complicated relationship between human consciousness and sound, and the ways that trauma, real or perceived, can echo through time and space, finding unexpected channels to reach us in the dark hours when we are most vulnerable and, perhaps, most receptive. The spring of 2018 marked what should have been a routine production schedule for director Jung Bum-shik and his carefully assembled crew. They were creating a found footage horror film inspired by Korea's most notorious abandoned building, but none of them could have anticipated that the boundary between performance and reality would dissolve so completely. What began as controlled scares and calculated atmosphere would transform into something far more sinister, leaving psychological scars that some crew members carry to this day. The production of Gonjiam Haunted Asylum had attracted significant attention even before cameras rolled. The filmmakers had secured permission to shoot at the actual location that inspired their script, a crumbling psychiatric hospital that locals refused to approach after dark. The cast of young actors arrived with the typical mixture of excitement and nervous energy that accompanies any horror production. They joked about ghosts during the first rehearsals. They took selfies in the deteriorating hallways. Lead actress Wai Ha-jun later admitted that the levity of those early days felt like a betrayal, given what they would eventually experience within those walls. The atmosphere shifted during the third day of production. The crew was setting up lighting equipment in the eastern wing when Wai Ha-jun entered what the production notes identified as the former isolation ward. She had walked through this same corridor twice before without incident, but something fundamental had changed. She described it later in an interview that the director reluctantly allowed, her voice still carrying the tremor of genuine fear. The air had become dense, she said, as if the space itself had contracted around her. The temperature dropped so dramatically that her breath became visible in the lens of the camera following her. But it was the sensation of being watched that truly unnerved her, not the passive observation of curious spirits, but something actively malevolent that seemed to study her with hostile intent. Wai Ha-jun refused to continue the scene. This was not a tantrum or artistic temperament. The director and several crew members who rushed to her side found her in a state of genuine shock, her hands trembling so violently she could not hold the prop flashlight she had been carrying. She pointed to a doorway at the end of the corridor, a threshold leading into one of the abandoned patient rooms. She told them she would not, under any circumstances, enter that space. When the assistant director suggested they could film her reaction from outside the doorway, she shook her head with such vehemence that the conversation ended immediately. Whatever she had sensed beyond that threshold had convinced her that crossing it would invite something terrible into her life. Production continued around her refusal. The director adjusted the shooting schedule, reassigned scenes, worked around what he initially dismissed as an overactive imagination fueled by the location's reputation. But Wai Ha-jun was not the only cast member beginning to report experiences that transcended the expected psychology of filming in a notoriously haunted location. Actor Park Sung-hoon mentioned hearing whispered conversations in empty rooms. Another actor, Lee Sung-wook, reported seeing shadows that move independently of any light source, flowing along walls with purposeful direction. The cinematographer began requesting that someone accompany him whenever he needed to retrieve equipment from the abandoned administrative offices on the second floor. These incidents accumulated like pressure building behind a dam. The crew developed unofficial protocols. No one worked alone. Equipment runs required at least 2 people. The building's third floor, which was not part of the filming schedule, became completely off limits after a production assistant emerged, from a brief exploration, utterly convinced that something had followed her down the stairs. But these precautions proved inadequate when Room 402 demanded their attention. Room 402 had a particular history even within the asylum's dark legacy. According to the fragmented records the production team had uncovered during research, this room had been used for experimental treatments in the hospital's final years of operation. The specifics remained unclear, lost in deliberately destroyed files and the selective amnesia of former staff members who refused to discuss that period. But the room's reputation had persisted through decades of abandonment. Local urban explorers who had ventured into the building before it was sealed claimed that Room 402 emanated a presence so overwhelming that even the most skeptical visitors refused to remain inside for more than moments. The production schedule called for a pivotal scene to be filmed in Room 402 during the second week of shooting. The director wanted to capture the climax of the film's narrative there, where the fictional characters would encounter their most terrifying experience. The irony of this decision would become apparent soon enough. Crew members prepared the room reluctantly, their usual professional banter replaced by terse, necessary communication. Lighting technician Kim Min-jae volunteered to complete the final equipment check alone, insisting that the small space was too crowded for multiple people. Kim Min-jae was a veteran of Korean horror productions. He had worked on films in abandoned schools, derelict factories, and decrepit temples. He took professional pride in maintaining composure regardless of atmosphere or rumor. When he entered Room 402 that afternoon, he carried his usual toolkit and a wireless radio to communicate with the crew stationed in the hallway outside. The team heard him confirm that he had entered the room. They heard the rustle of equipment being positioned. Then the radio transmitted only silence. 15 minutes passed before concern escalated to alarm. The assistant director called Kim Min-jae's name repeatedly through the radio, receiving no response. When they pushed open the door to Room 402, they found him unconscious on the floor, his body positioned in the exact center of the small space. His toolkit remained by the door where he had set it down, but his flashlight had been placed carefully on the windowsill across the room, arranged with its beam pointing directly at where he lay. The precision of this placement disturbed everyone who witnessed it. Kim Min-jae had not dropped the flashlight. Someone or something had positioned it with deliberate intent. The production medic examined him immediately. His vital signs were stable, but his state of unconsciousness was profound, resistant to the usual methods of rousing someone who had fainted. An ambulance transported him to the nearest hospital where doctors found no physical injuries, no signs of trauma, no medical explanation for his condition. He regained consciousness 6 hours later with absolutely no memory of entering Room 402. His last clear recollection was standing in the hallway, preparing to perform the equipment check. Everything that followed had been completely erased from his mind. Director Young Bum-shik made the decision to halt production immediately. This was not a choice made lightly. The financial pressures of film production are immense, and every day of delay compounds exponentially. But the director recognized that his crew had crossed a threshold into genuinely dangerous territory. What they were experiencing could no longer be rationalized as imagination or the power of suggestion. Something in that building was actively responding to their presence. The production shutdown lasted 3 days, but those days were filled with activity of a very different nature. The producers contacted a respected shaman from Seoul, a woman whose practice focused specifically on appeasing restless spirits and cleansing spaces of malevolent energy. She arrived with 2 assistants and spent an entire day examining the building before agreeing to perform the necessary rituals. What she told the director in private was never officially disclosed, but crew members reported seeing him emerge from that conversation visibly shaken, his certainty about continuing the production clearly wavering. The shamanic rituals began at dawn on the second day of the shutdown. The practitioners moved through each room where filming had occurred or was scheduled to occur, performing elaborate ceremonies that combined Buddhist and traditional Korean spiritual elements. They burned specific combinations of herbs, offered rice and fruit at makeshift altars, and chanted prayers meant to acknowledge the suffering of those who had died within those walls, while firmly establishing boundaries that the dead should not cross. The ritual for Room 402 lasted nearly 3 hours and required the shaman to enter and exit the space multiple times, each iteration building upon the protective layers established in the previous round. When filming resumed, the atmosphere on set had fundamentally changed. The crew worked with grim efficiency, maintaining the protective protocols the shaman had instructed. Small offerings of food and drink were left at designated spots throughout the building each morning. No one spoke disrespectfully about the location or its history. The previous gallows humor that often characterizes horror productions had evaporated entirely. These were people completing a job they now understood carried genuine risks that extended beyond the physical. Director Jung later spoke carefully about footage captured during those weeks, choosing his words with visible reluctance. There were shots, he said, that recorded phenomena the camera operators had not witnessed in real time. Shadows that appeared in frames where no shadow should exist. Fleeting figures visible in backgrounds that had been empty moments before and after. Audio recordings captured sounds that no one on set had heard. Whispers in Korean asking questions about why the living had returned to this place of death. The director made the decision to exclude this material from the final film. This was not because it lacked impact, he explained, but because including it felt like a violation of the understanding the shaman had helped establish. They had been permitted to complete their work, but publishing evidence of what truly dwelled in that building felt like breaking a covenant that kept everyone safe. The film was released in March of 2018 and became a massive commercial success, ultimately earning the distinction of second highest grossing Korean horror film in history. Audiences praised its authenticity, the genuine fear visible in the actors' performances, the palpable atmosphere of dread that permeated every scene. Critics noted that the cast seemed truly terrified in ways that transcended typical acting. They were correct, though they could not have known how literal that observation was. Wei Ha-jun has spoken sparingly about the production in the years since, but her reluctance carries more weight than any detailed account could. She has stated simply that some experiences cannot be adequately communicated to those who are not present, that certain fears live in the body rather than the mind and resist translation into language. When pressed about whether she believes the building was genuinely haunted, she responds that belief is irrelevant. What matters is what she experienced, what her body remembers even when her mind tries to rationalize it away. Kim Min-jae eventually returned to work on other productions, but he has never again volunteered for solo equipment runs, regardless of the location. The gap in his memory from room 402 remains absolute. Hypnotherapy and other methods to recover those lost hours have failed completely, as if that time was not merely forgotten, but somehow removed from his consciousness entirely. He considers this a mercy. Whatever happened in that room, whatever prompted his unconscious body to be arranged with such deliberate care, remains beyond his access, and he has no desire to recover it. The protective rituals performed by the shaman have become something of an open secret in Korean film production circles. Directors planning to shoot in locations with difficult reputations now routinely budget for spiritual consultants and cleansing ceremony. What was once dismissed as superstition has been reconsidered in light of what happened during the Gonjiam production. The industry learned that some boundaries demand respect, that the dead maintain claims on certain spaces that the living enter at their peril. The rain begins as it always does in Yangji, with a whisper against the leaves before building into something more insistent. On nights like these, Park Min-soo stands at his window in the apartment complex that overlooks the valley where Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital crouches in the darkness. He shouldn't look anymore. He knows this. But every time the storms come, he finds himself drawn to that window, watching the abandoned structure that local authorities insist is empty and secured. What he sees there has turned his hair noticeably grayer in just 3 years. The lights appear in windows on the 4th floor first, according to his detailed journal. Soft and amber, like old incandescent bulbs that haven't been manufactured in over a decade. They don't flicker the way flashlights would. They glow with a steady warmth that suggests someone inside has simply turned on a lamp to read by, as if the building still serves its original purpose. As if patients still occupy those rooms. Park has called the police 17 times. He stopped counting after that, stopped calling altogether when the officers who responded began recognizing his voice with poorly concealed sighs. The phenomenon extends far beyond one obsessive witness. Over 40 residents in the surrounding neighborhoods have filed similar reports since 2019. Kim Hae-jin, a schoolteacher who lives 2 kilometers from the hospital grounds, began documenting her sightings with a telephoto camera, lens after her husband accused her of imagining things. Her photographs, now numbering in the hundreds, show consistent patterns. Dark shapes in windows that appear vaguely humanoid. Lights that shouldn't exist in a building without electrical service. And something she noticed that chilled her to the bone. The figures seemed to move between windows, tracking from room to room, as if following some remembered routine from when the hospital functioned. What makes these accounts particularly unsettling is their correlation with an entirely separate phenomenon. Beginning in 2020, downloads of the infamous Gonjiam rain sound recordings, those ambient audio files that allegedly captured something beyond simple rainfall, spiked dramatically during storms. The pattern was first noticed by researchers monitoring online activity around the hospital. When rain falls over the actual building, downloads of the recordings increase by as much as 300%. But here's what keeps investigators awake. The spike begins approximately 30 minutes before the rain actually starts, as if something knows what's coming. Lee Sung-ho worked as a security guard at the hospital for exactly 11 days in 2021. His employment ended abruptly one Thursday night in March, and he refuses to discuss the specifics without his hands shaking. But his wife has spoken to local journalists, relaying what he told her during the sleepless nights that followed. He'd been making his rounds on the third floor, checking doors that the government had welded shut years ago. The rain had started an hour before, drumming steadily on the roof that leaked in 47 different places. He'd counted them during his first week, drops falling into buckets positioned throughout the corridors. The sound came from deeper in the building, beyond where his flashlight beam could reach. Footsteps, but not the sharp click of shoes against tile. Something softer, more deliberate. The shuffling steps of someone wearing slippers, the kind patients used to wear in psychiatric facilities. Lee called out, following protocol, announcing himself as security. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, he told his wife. It felt anticipatory, like something was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He heard his name spoken aloud. Not shouted or whispered, but stated clearly in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lee Sung-ho. 3 syllables pronounced with perfect clarity. He ran. Left his flashlight, his clipboard, his jacket with his phone in the pocket. Ran through corridors he'd memorized, downstairs where the railings were slick with moisture, and something else he didn't want to identify. He didn't stop until he reached his car, and he didn't come back even to collect his final paycheck. The security company he worked for had to mail it to him. He wasn't the first to quit, and he wasn't the last. The government contract for security at Gonjiam has changed hands 8 times in 4 years. The average tenure for guards assigned to overnight shifts is 19 days. Most leave without explanation, simply calling in to say they won't be returning. Those who do talk share disturbingly similar experiences. Footsteps in empty corridors. Doors they'd secured found standing open. And most commonly, the sensation of being watched from the upper floors when they're outside the building. That prickling certainty that something behind dark windows is observing their every move. Choi Yeon-soo lasted longer than most, nearly 2 months on the night shift. She's a former military police officer, trained to handle confrontation, not easily spooked by shadows or strange sounds. What finally drove her away wasn't something she heard or saw, but something she felt. She describes it as a pull, an almost magnetic sensation drawing her deeper into the building during her rounds. Every night, she found herself wanting to explore further, to climb to the upper floors that were officially off-limits due to structural concerns. She'd catch herself standing at the base of staircases, 1 foot already on the first step, with no memory of having walked there. On her final night, she realized she was on the 4th floor. She has no recollection of climbing the stairs, of passing through the chain doors, of navigating the maze of corridors in total darkness. She came to awareness standing in a patient room, rain streaming through a broken window, staring at a chair positioned to face the door. Someone had placed it there recently. The dust patterns on the floor made that clear. The chair had been moved within hours, perhaps minutes. She left that night and never returned, even to collect her personal belongings from the guard station. The 2021 incident crystallized these scattered reports into something the government could no longer dismiss. Facing mounting pressure to address the hospital's deteriorating condition, and its draw for trespassers, the Ministry of Environment commissioned a comprehensive drone survey of the structure. The goal was documentation before demolition, a full visual record for historical archives. What the drones captured instead became classified for 7 months before public pressure forced its release in redacted form. The footage begins ordinarily enough. Exterior shots of the building in daylight, cataloging structural damage, documenting the breach points where trespassers had defeated security measures. The drones then approach the windows, high-resolution cameras capturing details of the interior spaces. In window after window on the eastern wing's 4th floor, the footage shows figures. Dark shapes that possess a distinctly human silhouette. Some appear to be standing. Others seem to be seated. One appears to be pressed against the glass, as if looking out. The drone operators noticed immediately. They maneuvered for closer inspection, bringing the cameras within meters of the windows. But as the drones approached, the figures receded, pulling back into the darkness of the rooms beyond. Frame-by-frame analysis later showed that the shapes didn't simply move away. They dissipated, becoming less distinct until they merged entirely with the shadows. When the drones pulled back, the figures would gradually reappear, resuming their positions as if the drones had never approached. The government's official statement called the shapes tricks of light and shadow, products of the building's deteriorating interior and the angle of the sun. But the footage was taken over a 6-hour period under varying light conditions. The figures appeared consistently, regardless of the time or the sun's position. Independent analysts who examined the released footage identified at least 14 distinct shapes across 7 different windows. One analyst noted that the figures seemed to distribute themselves in a pattern consistent with patient room assignments from the hospital's operational period, as if they were occupying their old spaces. This brings us to the question that haunts local officials and keeps residents awake during storms. Why does Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital still stand? The building has been slated for demolition 4 separate times since 2017. Each time, the process has been initiated. Contracts signed. Equipment moved on site. Demolition crews assembled and briefed. And each time, something has prevented the work from proceeding. The first attempt in 2017 ended when 3 workers were injured in separate incidents within a single day. Accidents, the official report stated, all from scaffolding, a malfunctioning hydraulic system, a piece of equipment that shifted unexpectedly. But the foreman noted in his incident report that all 3 men had been working on the eastern wing, the oldest part of the structure, where the most persistent sightings occur. His crew refused to return after that day, and the demolition company withdrew from the contract. 2019 saw another attempt, this time with a different company and additional safety protocols. Work proceeded for 3 days before the equipment began failing. Hydraulic lines burst without explanation. Electrical systems shorted out, despite being newly installed. On the 4th day, a wrecking ball struck the eastern wing's wall and simply stopped, the impact producing none of the expected destruction. The wall cracked, but didn't crumble. Engineers examining the scene couldn't explain it. Concrete was old, weathered, structurally compromised according to all their surveys. It should have come down easily. Instead, it absorbed the impact as if the building itself was resisting. The most recent attempt came in 2022. This time, the government hired an international demolition firm with experience in complex structural removals. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, conducted extensive surveys, prepared for every possible complication. They began work on a clear morning in October. By afternoon, 2 crew members had been hospitalized with sudden onset respiratory distress. By evening, the site supervisor was demanding answers about the sounds his team reported hearing from inside the building. Voices calling out in Korean, though the building had been empty and sealed. The project was suspended pending investigation. The investigation concluded there were no safety violations, no environmental hazards, nothing that explained the incidents. But the company declined to resume work, forfeiting their substantial deposit rather than return to the site. Local authorities now face an impossible situation. The building is a public hazard, a magnet for trespassers, and a source of constant complaints from nearby residents. But every attempt to remove it has failed. The costs have been enormous, both financially and in terms of public confidence. Rumors circulate in the town that the building doesn't want to come down, that something inside is protecting it. Engineers offer more prosaic explanations about construction methods and materials from the 1960s that make demolition unexpectedly complex. But these explanations don't account for the pattern of failures, the consistency of the strange incidents, the way each attempt seems actively opposed by forces that have nothing to do with engineering. Meanwhile, the sightings continue. On any given rainy night, you can find residents at their windows, watching the dark shell of Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. Some see nothing, and convince themselves the others are imagining things. But enough see the lights, witness the figures, feel the unsettling certainty that the building isn't as empty as it should be. They've learned to live with it, the way people learn to live near volcanoes or fault lines. It's simply part of the landscape now, this haunted monument to suffering that refuses to be forgotten or destroyed. And when the rain comes, they watch and wait, wondering what it is that walks those corridors, what memory or echo or something worse has made that place its own. There are questions that refuse to die, and Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital holds more than its share of them. Even now, decades after its doors closed for the final time, the mysteries surrounding this place remain as impenetrable as the overgrown forest that has slowly consumed its crumbling wall. What truly happened in room 402? This question echoes through every investigation, every testimony, every sleepless night spent reviewing evidence. The room sits at the end of a corridor on the 4th floor, its door permanently sealed, or so the stories tell us. Some say the director ordered it welded shut. Others claim it was bricked over from the inside. But here is what troubles investigators most deeply. The accounts of what occurred in that room never quite align, yet they share disturbing similarities. Patients who entered for treatment would emerge changed, if they emerged at all. Staff members who checked on occupants would find empty beds, the patients having vanished despite locked doors and barred windows. One nurse, in a statement given to local authorities in 1994, claimed she heard screaming from room 402 for 3 consecutive nights, yet each time she unlocked the door, the room stood empty, its single bed neatly made, undisturbed. On the 4th night, the screaming stopped. She never returned to work. The disappearance of the director himself presents an even deeper enigma. A man does not simply vanish from existence, leaving behind no trace, no explanation, no forwarding address. Yet, this is precisely what happened. The official records list his last day at the hospital as October 9, 1996, though the hospital itself would not close for several more weeks. His office was found locked from the inside, his personal belongings still in place, his coat hanging on its hook. His car remained in the parking lot for months afterward, collecting leaves and dust, until eventually it was towed away by authorities. Bank accounts went untouched. Family members received no contact. He had disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. What makes this disappearance even more perplexing is the timing. Former staff members report that in the weeks leading up to his vanishing, the director had become increasingly obsessed with certain patient files, specifically those connected to room 402. He was seen entering the sealed room alone, late at night, despite having ordered everyone else to stay away from it. Security logs, fragmentary as they are, show his keycard being used to access the 4th floor at unusual hours, 2 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, 3:15 in the morning. One security guard, who has since passed away, told his family that he saw the director standing in the 4th floor hallway, motionless, staring at the door to room 402 for over an hour without moving. When the guard approached to ask if everything was all right, the director turned to him with what the guard described as a look of profound terror, and said only, "They're still here. All of them. They never left. Then we confront perhaps the most unsettling mystery of all. The consistent pattern of experiences reported across 2 decades by individuals who had no knowledge of previous accounts, no connection to one another, no reason to corroborate their story. Urban explorers in the early 2000s reported feeling sudden drops in temperature in specific locations within the hospital, the same locations where patients in the 1980s claimed to feel cold spots. Photographers captured unexplained light anomalies, in rooms where staff members from the 1990s had reported seeing figures. Voice recordings picked up whispers and cries in the exact hallways where patients had complained of hearing voices. This pattern defies simple explanation. Mass hysteria requires a shared context, a way for the fear to spread from person to person. But these witnesses were separated by years, sometimes decades, with no exposure to each other's experiences. They walked into the hospital blind, so to speak, and yet they walked out describing the same phenomena, down to specific details. The feeling of being watched from the fourth-floor windows. The sound of footsteps on the floor above, even when you're on the top floor. The sensation of someone standing just behind you, close enough to touch, their breath on your neck. Skeptics might argue coincidence, pattern recognition, the human mind's tendency to find meaning in randomness. But coincidence wears thin when the same experiences repeat across hundreds of accounts, across different seasons, different times of day, different phases of the moon and weather condition. At what point does coincidence become something else entirely? At what point must we consider that these witnesses might be reporting something real, even if we lack the framework to understand what that reality might be? And then there are the rain recordings, those seemingly innocent sounds captured for sleep and relaxation, shared across the internet to millions of unsuspecting listeners. Audio engineers have examined these files with professional equipment, and what they found resists conventional explanation. There are frequencies present that should not exist in simple rain recordings. Patterns in the white noise that suggest structure, intention, something that borders on communication. One acoustic specialist noted subsonic elements that pulse at intervals matching a human heartbeat, yet no heartbeat was present during the recording. Another discovered what he described as layered audio phenomena, sounds buried beneath the rain that, when isolated and amplified, resemble human voices speaking in no recognizable language. Most disturbing is the binaural analysis performed by a researcher in South Korea. When the stereo field was examined, the rain sounds showed anomalies in spatial positioning that suggested movement, as if the source of the sound was circling the microphones. Rain does not move this way. Rain does not orbit a fixed point with such precision. Yet there it is in the data, undeniable, unexplainable. Some questions may never have answers, and perhaps we must make peace with that uncomfortable truth. The human desire for closure, for neat explanations that tie up every loose end, may be a luxury we cannot afford when confronting phenomena that exist outside our understanding. Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital stands as a monument to the limits of what we can know, a reminder that the universe contains spaces where our certainty dissolves. Perhaps the power of Gonjiam lies not in what we know, but in what we fear. It is the unknown that haunts us most deeply, the questions without answers, the sounds we cannot explain, the experiences that refuse to fit into comfortable categories. The hospital has become a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties about reality itself. That the world is not as solid as we believe, that there are things beyond our perception, that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. What troubles me most as I conclude this investigation is how the hospital continues to draw people in, even now, even through something as innocent as rain sounds for sleep. Think about that for a moment. Millions of people around the world have downloaded these recordings, placed them on their phones, their tablets, their bedside speakers. They play them as they close their eyes, as they surrender to unconsciousness during those vulnerable twilight moments between waking and sleep, when the mind is most open, most susceptible. The building itself refuses to be forgotten. It reaches beyond its walls, beyond its gates, beyond the overgrown paths and rusted warning signs. It reaches into our homes, into our bedrooms, into our most private moments of rest. And we invite it in willingly, never suspecting that the gentle rain we use to soothe ourselves to sleep might carry with it something else entirely, something that waits patiently in the spaces between the drops, in the static beneath the storm. Gonjiam has found a way to survive its own destruction, to persist beyond abandonment and decay. It lives now in the digital realm, in audio files and photographs, in stories shared across forums and social media. But most of all, it lives in those moments when you're almost asleep, when you're listening to the rain, and for just a second, you hear something else beneath it. A whisper, a footstep, a door slowly opening. And in that moment, the distance between you and that abandoned hospital on the hill collapses to nothing at all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.